Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm speaking with sports psychologist Dr. Scott Goldman. Scott, welcome.
Oh my gosh, it's so great to be back. I feel like I left my slippers at the last time we met. What is this, number four, number five? Uh, Talking with you and having this opportunity to be on this show is just such a highlight for me. It's like the best thing of my week. So I've been looking forward to this all day.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure, as always. How's life? What's been going on in your world?
Life is good. I appreciate you asking. I have found the phrase off season no longer really exists in professional sports. We're just now out of season. And then because I've got contracts with, an NBA team, an NFL team, and a Major League Baseball team, it makes it so that there really is never an out of season for me. And I hope this doesn't come across like complaining, just the opposite. I consider myself to be so fortunate and blessed to be working with such talented people and having such just activating conversations.
Well, you're certainly a busy man, and you've been on the show a few times before. So I know that most people listening in will know you and your work very, very well. But why don't you reintroduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience? Tell us a little bit about you. Tell us a bit about your work.
Sure. So my name is Scott Goldman. I like long walks on the beach and rainy days. Maybe like dinners. No, sorry, that's just me being snarky, I guess. Um, I am a clinical psychologist, high performance psychologist. So I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I have two PhDs. One's in clinical psychology and the other one's in school psychology. I've always thought of coaching as a pedagogy. And for those that don't know, it's like coaching is teaching, right? And I think most people would agree with that. So I put a
Mm.
lot of that school psychology training into play when I work with teams and systems where I'm helping the coaches in the front office. In addition to that, I did some advanced training in high performance psychology, exercise science, kinesiology. So working with players directly. I've always thought of sports psychology as not being like, and I'd be curious your thoughts on this, but to me, sports psychology is not hard, but I do think it is complicated.
Mm.
And I think we can do a great job of clarifying all the different touch points that we have as psychologists within a system. So, for example, you can work one on one with a player, and that can be about mental health, or it can be about optimal performance. You can work with a coach, you can work with the relationship between the player and the coach. And then you can also work with the front office, just kind of talking about like system design, organizational design. I found recently um, my engagements with teams have now kind of evolved to being more in the front office and at the leadership level. So, head coach, GM, team president, ownership, and really kind of trying to help them understand how to really make the boat row faster. So, I kind of went on a tangent there, but just to kind of go back and just hit some key points in my resume. For 25 plus years, I've been an embedded sports psychologist. I started as one of the first embedded psychologists at the university level, University of Arizona. Did that for 8 years. Then I was with University of Michigan for four, where I was the lead person for their athletic department as a resource. Then I migrated out of the college space and I worked for the Miami Dolphins for 5 years, which is an NFL team, the Detroit Lions for 3 years, which is also an NFL team, the Washington Wizards, which is an NBA team, the Golden State Warriors, which I'm now on year seven and continue to work with them. And then I also work with the Minnesota Vikings, another NFL team. And then I've done some work with the Chicago Cubs, which is a Major League Baseball team.
Busy man.
Just honestly been very fortunate and blessed to have had opportunities to have really cool conversations with cool people. My own personal mission statement is I just want to do cool stuff with cool people. And then, I think something that's also worth noting, and I always forget, but I am really proud of this, which is I developed a test called the AIQ, which measures sport specific intelligence. It's being used across all five major leagues in the United States: NFL, NBA, NHL, MLS, and MLB, as well as English Premier League teams, a team in Australia, one of the women's World Cup teams. I don't know when you're going to air this, but one of the women's World Cup teams that has advanced to the round of eight um, has been using the AIQ for a while as part of their development. And then in New Zealand, some rugby teams, things like that. So it's been exciting, and I think it's the AIQ that has really given me a great opportunity to expand not just on understanding how players think, but then has led me to be in certain buildings and have some really meaningful conversations. So I think the AIQ is this great instrument to really help understand and process how the players do what they do.
And there's a whole episode where we unpack the AIQ. I believe you use that quite extensively across the combine. You're involved in that in the NFL.
Yeah, I mean, so teams are using it for pre-draft selection, but they're also
Hmm.
using it for talent development. So again, thinking
Okay.
about coaching as a pedagogy, like if coaches are teachers, understanding how their players absorb and process and apply information is essential. So, just to give you some concrete examples, um, and let's talk about football or what Americans call soccer. You think about a central midfielder having to have an awareness of where they are in relation to everyone around them. 360-degree sort of game sense. Well, that's a cognitive ability.
Yeah.
Or if you think about, say, a striker who might drift off sides, that's a cognitive ability of just knowing where you are in relation to others. So we measure things like that. And it's been really fun because like with the women's national team that's using the AIQ that's in the World Cup right now, that was one of the conversations was they had their nine. And I was going over the profile with the player and with the coach. And I said, do you drift off sides? And the two of them looked at each other and kind of smiled. And I said, are you supremely fast? And the striker, the nine, said, yeah. How did you know? And I go, well, I'm just wondering if, like I said, I didn't know. I'm just kind of analyzing the AIQ data, but I'm wondering if you might be a better fit to be a winger. And at this point, the head coach started laughing really hard. And she started smiling from ear to ear because she was like, yeah, for my club team, I'm a winger. And they're trying to make me a nine here. And the head coach goes, I think we're ready to abandon that experiment. And so, it was something that they were kind of struggling with during development and training camp. And I think the AIQ gave some additional information that said, hey, this is a better fit for her to be in this other position. And that's the kind of stuff that I think is really cool about the AIQ.
Well, it's just fascinating, and we've spoken quite extensively about the cognitive side of performance on the Sports Science Show. We've spoken at length about awareness, anticipation, decision making, and just pointing all of our listeners to episode 78, Scott. So way back at episode 78, we unpacked the AIQ and went into it in greater depth. And I know we're both keen to talk more about leadership because that's so much of your role at the moment, especially with Golden State Warriors. But as I would suggest as a neat segue to that, I mean, listening to the experience you've had there using the AIQ with a successful international team and your interactions with the head coach and how that head coach, as a consequence of the data you put in front of that coach, had to lead on that data, had to lead in a flexible manner and actually abandon a part of their game model or a tactical plan within their game model. That sounds like you were integral to a flexing of leadership, a flexing of process, if you like.
So, Dan, I think you and I are kind of cut from the same cloth. So I appreciate the compliment, but we're both having of the same mindset, which is like never take more credit than you deserve, right? So to say like, hey, we're integral and all that kind of stuff, I do believe in the AIQ and I do believe in its value, but I also want to be real humble and say like, I think good coaches figure it out eventually.
Yeah.
Great coaches figure it out faster, and the really outstanding coaches use the resources that are made available to them so they can get to those conclusions with efficiency. So I actually give the coach a lot of credit for listening and absorbing the information and coming to a well-informed decision.
But that's great leadership in and of itself, isn't it?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, it's really interesting. Like, heavy is the head that wears the crown, right? And you have a lot of people who want to give you information. And, what's the old expression? Like, garbage in equals garbage out, right? So I think part of great leadership is knowing what pieces of information amplify the signal and what pieces of information are just noise. And it's hard. I think, and what's also hard is as a leader, like this would be a good example of some of the work that I'm doing now is when I'm working with new head coaches, first time head coaches. One of the first things, not one of the first things, but one of the a recurring theme, it's happened with every coach that I've worked with as a first time head coach, but I'm not saying it's an absolute, it's just a very frequent engagement for me, is they'll say something like, Scott, I really thought that this was about me knowing my X's and O's, like my play calling. Like I'm very confident in that kind of stuff. And I think that's why they hired me. And managing people is something I always thought I was good at until I became the head coach. And I'll go, well, give me an example of what something you're struggling with. So let me just land on that before I go to the example. But I think the aha for them was like when you're an offensive coordinator, you only have to manage so much of the ship. But when you're the head coach, you're responsible for the entire cruise ship. Every staff member, everybody. Media, 360 degrees, ownership, and so what I find is it becomes somewhat overwhelming where they go, gosh, managing people when all I really want to do is develop my game plan for this week. And so I have found that some of the people that I'm working with have really enjoyed and valued and engaged in having a place to process, like, how do I manage people? And I don't know if manage is the right word, but it really is about the idea of understanding who you have in your personnel, right? Like, know your people, KYP, and understanding how to get the best out of everyone. So here's the example that I have for you. There is a coach who has an unbelievable heart. And he said to me that every time I talk to somebody in our system, I recognize that it's the most important 5 minutes of their day because of my role. But I don't have the time to give everybody these 5 minutes. So he says when I leave, so he's working on his game plan and stuff like that. He leaves his office and he's walking down the hallway, and just a bunch of people will go, "Hey, coach, you got a sec?" The nutritionist, "Coach, you got a sec?" Director of ops, "Coach, you got a sec?" And all of the individuals that go to the coach feel like, "Hey, I only took 5 minutes of his time." But for him, he's like, when I leave my office, it'll sometimes take me 2 hours to get back to my office when I had only planned for a 10-minute walk down the hallway to go grab like a notebook or something. And he's like, "Well, what's the solution here?" And I jokingly say, like, "Well, why don't you just keep more notebooks in your office?" And he laughs, but we both know, like, that's not the issue. And especially because once you start to isolate yourself in the office, you lose touch because the thing that nutritionist needed to say to you, the thing that the director of ops needed to say to you is lost. So, the one thing, especially with these professional teams, they have so much money, they have so much resources, but the one thing they can't generate more of is time. And so sometimes it's even about helping the coach realize the value of their own time and to say, like, okay, can you ask somebody to meet later? Can you delay what they need? So there's this great, like, kind of military thing of like, is it essential and is it urgent, right? Or is it important or is it urgent? If it's important, urgent, handle it right there. If it's urgent but not important, delegate it to someone else. If it's not urgent but important, delay it till when you have time to deal with it. And if it's not urgent and it's not important, maybe you let it go. So simple little things like that, I think, can really help when they have to make that decision of, hey, coach, do you have a sec? And they can say, hey, is this urgent or can it wait? Stuff like that.
As you were speaking there, I wrote a few notes down, and I'm probably not going to formulate a question, so I'm just going to reflect these notes back at you, and maybe you can have a think and share your thoughts here. So I actually wrote down three leadership factors here that are important: the ability to distinguish between signal and noise. Number two, getting the best out of someone. And number three, decision making and delegation. So signal versus noise, getting the best out of someone, and decision making and delegation. And obviously, those three are intertwined. I wrote down some skills that I think are relevant to those factors. So, for instance, signal versus noise has a real experience and knowledge feel to it. The more experienced one is, the greater amount of knowledge one has, the greater chance you have of detecting signal amongst all of the noise. Getting the best out of someone, factor two. Obviously, I wrote down people skills, but that could be added to experience and knowledge as well. And then that final factor of decision making and delegation. As you were telling me that story, I was immediately thinking of the importance of delegation, probably more so than decision making. But I was thinking of the skills of self skills, self awareness, self control, the ability. I think self control has a real sort of in the moment, as you say, okay, I can't deal with this right now. I'm going to have to put this off. A real decision making feel around oneself, and then delegation has a trust feel to it as well. So a couple of minutes ramble there, but those are the kind of skills and factors related to leadership that I heard.
Yeah, so let's start with one of the last points that you made, which was kind of like the idea of management,
Mm.
right? So one of the things that I'll ask a first-time head coach is I'll say, "Do you want to focus on coaching or do you want to focus on leading?"
Ooh.
And they'll go, "Well, I want to do both." And I'll go, "Yeah." The reality, though, is with the expansion and the sheer vast number of staff members now, like professional sports has more engorged staffs than ever before. And every head coach, leader, GM that I talk to, they all say the whole thing like, wow, there's a lot of people here. I mean, they all say it right now. They're just, as they're on their way to the practice field, it's almost like they're kind of having to like duck and dodge and dive away from people because there's just so many people just standing around. So I say, which do you want to do? And most of them go like, hey, I want to just coach. And I go, okay, who's going to lead them? Who are you delegating that leadership role to? And that's where they tend to get like, I go, your chief of staff. Because you can have like a really good chief of staff who can then oversee a lot of your support staff and stuff like that. But most people want them to lead, or most people want to interact with the head coach or the GM, right? So we kind of go through that process. The second thing that you talked about, or the thing that you said right before that, and I want to give Littleton, Lyttleton. He's an author, and he wrote a book called The Edge,
Yep.
where it's a book that's meant for business, but I find it applies both in sport and business. What he does is each chapter he goes and interviews and kind of just gets embedded into a sport team that has outperformed. And he just says like, hey, what's your edge? And in one of those chapters, there was a segment that really resonated with me where he was talking about, you know, players that are on loan and players throughout like English Premier League
Yeah.
and European football, and how they're kind of they're not really traded, but they're kind of like what's the expression? I always forget.
Are you speaking to players that are sent out on loan for a period of time? So
Yes.
they don't transfer, but they might be on loan for half a season or a full season or
Yeah.
something like that.
So it's
Yeah.
either loan or transfer. Like, in American sports, we just call it free agency, right?
Okay.
Or trades. So what's interesting and what really resonated to me about the chapter is he talks about how when we grab these players, what we're really wanting is the production. And what we're missing is that production is really a formula of the player times the environment that they came from.
Hmm.
So when we pluck the player out of previous team's environment, we make a foolish assumption that we're plucking their productivity and inserting it into our team's flow. And kind of like a new computer, like when you get a new computer and you get super excited about the new things it can do, but then you always forget there's some feature of the old computer that didn't migrate over that you really missed more than you thought and didn't realize how much you relied on it. So I'm finding sometimes with some of these high priced free agents in American sports or some of the loans and transfer players is it's not working, and there's this confusion why it's not. And having some of the dialogue and the exploration, it's these little things that you just aren't aware of. So, for example, there was a player that I was talking with who was struggling, and one of the things he shared with me was how important the nutritionist from the previous team was to him. And what he said was every time he went to training table, she would come by and talk to him, and it just was a calming thing for him. And he didn't realize how important that 10-15 minute dialogue was throughout his day. And the previous team didn't realize its value either, and the current team didn't realize its value, but that was something that was missing. So his production was off because there was a piece of the environment that was missing. So that's a part of it too, is I think when we're talking about talent evaluation, and this goes back to amplifying the signal and eliminating the noise, is it's hard. Again, I don't think sports psychology is hard, but it's complicated to really assess what are the pieces and what are the threads and how are we pulling on them and how can we replace them. So, another story is there was a professional team I was working with where there was a coach on the staff who people were kind of struggling to see their value because their coaching acumen was not as strong as some of the other coaches on the staff. However, the head coach really trusted this person and valued this person. And so, as we were processing it with ownership and the front office, help us understand why this guy's around, I said to them, you ever have a long week and you come home and maybe you pour yourself a martini and kind of decompress? And they go, yeah. I go, what if this coach is kind of like a martini for the head coach? And if we thought about his contribution to our system is less about how he develops that position room that he was responsible for and more about the fact that he helps our head coach be the best version of coaching. And that changed the dialogue about how people interacted with that coach, that position coach.
What I'm hearing and what I love about what you're saying is the nuance of coaching and leadership here. At least that's what I'm experiencing. Um, with regard to your story, that relates to Ben Littleton's book, and actually Ben has been on the Sports Psych Show, episode 59, talking about the edge. So it's particularly apt, Scott. But a real, as you say, signal versus noise, and I often have conversations with coaches and leaders around players have histories, it's understanding, and we're talking about the nuance here of coaching and or leadership if we're going to distinguish between the two, which I respect that you have. But it's understanding that the people in your environment have histories, and perhaps they've been brought in for a reason for their success, but their success is so often a product of what they've experienced in their previous environment. And it almost has a solution-focused brief therapy feel to it in terms of, well, what's worked there that we can repeat, and what hasn't worked over there that we want to stop doing. So a real sort of solution-focused feel to leadership and coaching there. I love it. And also what I loved your second story about, was it the martini coach, and just thinking about, again, coaching and leadership taking place within systems, and looking at systemically what is the role of these people and how are they influencing the system, and potentially never underestimating even the smallest of role, even if you consider, that person isn't a great coach, right? But maybe that person isn't a wonderful coach on the field of play, but maybe that person, as you say, is a tonic that the head coach utilizes. So, leadership, coaching, enveloped by systems, and there's a sort of a two-way influence there between both. Again, Scott, no question, but just some thoughts on what you said.
Well, so something that I have couple of thoughts. I mean, first, you have some of the best guests. I mean, what a great show. And I'm just humbled and honored to be like the filler between the really good ones, like and so it's just like it doesn't shock me that you had Ben on. And his book is fantastic,
It is good.
and just so you know, I get no endorsement deals from him or anything like that. I just really enjoyed his book. But one of the things that I've discovered throughout my career is that I've become somewhat of a like a honeybee in a way. Like I've discovered that I've been able to cross pollinate. And part of that cross pollination initially for me was going between the sports, NBA, NFL, Major League Baseball and NHL and some of that. Now I'm finding myself engaging like in executive coaching and working in the corporate world, and it's been really fascinating. And I bring it up because there was a high class executive that I was working with who gave me some insight where he said, every deal is a minor miracle. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting statement. Why is that? And he said, there's 1,000 things that can happen, and you only need one of them for the whole thing to get derailed. And I went, gosh, man, that sounds an awful lot like trying to win a championship. So I've kind of migrated that into sport where I go like, it's funny because you really do have to have everything go right in order to have something amazing happen. And you feel that in professional sports space. You feel that sense of urgency and that kind of edge of perfection, even when it mutates towards bad production. But you feel that idea of like, if I don't bring my best today, if I'm just 1% off, I mean, especially like in the league like the NFL, where parity is so rampant. Um, I mean, again, being around the NFL for about 5 years, whatever it was,
Mm.
um, it was amazing because the dialogue is always like, hey, if we had just gotten the first down against the Giants in week 7, we'd be in the Super Bowl right now. I mean, it comes down to that kind of minutia.
Yeah.
And so that too becomes kind of an interesting perspective. Um, I've got an interesting one that I think could be fun for us to engage in.
Mm.
So, one of the one of the exercises that I like to do with leaders and executives is I'll ask them. I'll say like, I think there's 3 kind of pillars to good leadership: authenticity, being true to who you are, right? Knowledge, being having the answers to the test, being wise. And then the last one's compassion. Now, the literature really talks more about empathy, and I like to separate compassion and empathy. And the reason why is like empathy is kind of like understanding, like, walking in their shoes kind of thing. Compassion is you don't necessarily have to understand it, you just have to want to help. So, the exercise that I like to engage is I'll say, like, hey, tell me, you can think of yourself like when you were golfing, right, during your golfing days, or you can think of yourself as a provider, or you can think of yourself as a coach. But in a time where you were in a relationship where there was a mentorship aspect to it, either you were on the receiving end or the delivering end, what did you feel like the person who was leading that relationship was their strength? The authenticity, the knowledge, or the compassion? What was their strength?
I think when I've been on the receiving end of good mentorship, I would say the strength of that mentor, because that person was helping me, was compassion, because that person was listening to me and cared. Otherwise, they just wouldn't have been a
Hmm.
mentor for me. So I think, that mentor had great knowledge, and I think that can be the difference between a mentor and a coach. Without going off topic here, a mentor has a good knowledge of your area, and authenticity. I can only but think that that person was as authentic as one could be in that moment with me, or those moments with me. But definitely the word compassion comes through because that person didn't have to be helping me at all.
Mm, interesting. So it's funny, like now let's go the other direction. Tell me a time where you witnessed a coach or a leader of some sort or a mentor, or even it could be you when you were in that role,
Mm.
where the relationship failed.
I think probably the converse of what I was saying there. I definitely think that where coaches may struggle, or leaders again, understanding that they may be similar, overlapping, different, however one wants to define them. I think compassion tends to be an area because there's so much pressure, because there's so much challenge. Compassion may be areas that I've seen coaches not as evolved in. That's not to say I haven't seen fantastically compassionate coaches. I absolutely, and coaching, I absolutely have. But that would be the area that shines out for me. There, I'd say when it's not worked, when perhaps a head coach or a manager, as we might call them here in the UK in soccer football, when perhaps they've even lost their job because they've lost the change room, a lack of compassion potentially.
So it's interesting, right? So the compassion bucket, which it seems is the one that you read. So the nice thing is when I'm doing this with leaders, again, front office, GMs, head coaches, managers, or in the corporate space, I find this exercise because each one of these buckets has a lot of depth for discussion and growth and understanding.
Yes,
But
yes, of course, yeah. Yeah, and that's what I was thinking as I was speaking there. I was thinking, oh wow, there's definitely coaches I worked with who perhaps lacked a bit of knowledge in certain areas that held them back. That type of thing. So I appreciate the depth.
yeah, so but you're kind of resonating with the compassion bucket. So let's go down that rabbit hole for a bit.
Yeah,
Um, I think we're having an interesting moment right now in sport and sports psychology. You and I are kind of we're old guys sitting on a rocking chair, whittling or something. You know, like we've been around the block a few times. Um, like,
I feel like it sometimes.
well,
Yeah.
you know, like I went to high school with Neil Patrick Harris, and I used to tell people like, "Oh, you know, I know Doogie Howser," and that was kind of funny until talking with certain players that are like, "What's a Doogie?" You know, and,
That's so funny.
and
Doogie Howser was awesome. Classic 80s program.
well, and that's so again. I think we just lost half your audience because they're now googling like, "What's a Doogie?" But that isn't that like that's another talking point that I talk with some leadership people. Is I say like, look, and I know this is a podcast, so I'm not quite sure I can deliver this without the video. But if you ask somebody like over the age of 35 to make a hand gesture for a phone,
Mm.
more often than not, over the age of 35, what they'll do is they will see you're doing it. Now,
They
your
can't see it,
audience
but
can't
most
see
of them
what
will
you're
know
doing.
if they're over 35 what I'm doing.
Right. And what you're doing is you're basically putting like your thumb to your
Yep.
ear and your pinky to your mouth. So it looks kind of like a handset phone from, again, what we grew up
Yes.
with. But if you ask people under the age of 35 to make a phone gesture with their hand, what they'll give you is a flat palm
Yeah, of course.
because what they're used to is what they're more acclimated to is that look of a cell phone, like really the iPhone and how the iPhone has changed
Yeah.
everything. So you go, why is this a different or why is this an important distinction? And it's not really about the cell phone, but what it's about is perspective. So while we're talking about compassion, part of it is also having perspective. So again, you'll hear from older coaches, these kids these days, it's almost like a Scooby Doo episode. And again, for those that are younger, you might have to Google what Scooby Doo is, but it's the idea of like, and I could have gotten away if it wasn't for you dang kids kind of
Yeah.
thing. But there is something to be said for this. So, for example, Google did some research and they found that the current workforce, the 20-year-old current workforce, that their attention span has dropped by an average of 4 seconds. So if I go on kind of a long tangent in this conversation, and I appreciate you letting me get kind of ramble, there was an amazing thing from my generation. So I was born in the 70s, and that was the advent of Sesame Street. Now, the brilliant creators of Sesame Street said, we need to educate, but we need to educate in the manner that most kids, especially kids from rural or impoverished areas, are being exposed to, which is commercials. So they use kind of like this sort of commercial format. It was
Mm,
quick, it was edgy, but it wasn't that kind of slow, drawn out process that, say, like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood had engaged in. So why do I bring this up? I bring it up because it was wonderfully effective, and we had a shortened attention span as a result of it. I mention it because we're now seeing that same artifact reappear. So the attention span shrank in the 70s, 80s, and a big contribution to that was Sesame Street's influence in how kids were absorbing information. Well, now the workforce, the 20-year-old workforce and teenagers are absorbing information through things like Instagram and Twitter and um, TikTok, and those videos average about 7 seconds. So when dialoguing with leaders, and they're kind of going kids these days, and it's like, well, look, we had our attention span shortened by Sesame Street. They're having their attention span shortened by some of this social media. And that just means that we have to engage in a more concise message. What's the old adage? If I had more time, I would have written a shorter novel. I'm not doing a very good job of modeling that while explaining this concept because I'm going on all kinds of deep threads with Sesame Street, but the concept exists.
how are you linking that with? I think you're about to come on and tell me, how are you linking this with compassion?
Because we don't quite understand what the needs are.
Okay.
So, for a while there, one of the trends in sports was about radical candor. And there was a book that came out, Radical Candor. It's a great book, well written. And the idea that, unfortunately, like the concept was we should be honest with one another, we should be truthful. I think it kind of mutated to a place with folks who might be a tad bit aggressive, where they would go something like, hey, Dan, you've got pretty hairy eyebrows. And then they'd say, you're welcome. See, I'm just being radical candor. I'm just telling you about your eyebrows. You're welcome. And meanwhile, you're kind of like, dude, what's up with my eyebrows? And now you walk away and you're kind of like, feel a little bit more insecure. So it's like, that didn't quite hit. The new terminology that's kind of coming around and being bounced around is called radical transparency. And I'm having leaders that are going, okay, what's that? And I go, radical transparency is that people are posting themselves in vulnerable ways to the world. And so they're now more comfortable having sensitive information being kind of publicly discussed. So, a good example of this is the fact that people in the workforce are more comfortable talking about their salaries than ever before.
Okay.
So, now let's bring it to sport. Radical transparency and this kind of dialogue. It used to be a fairly common tactic for some coaches where they would really rip into a player at practice because they were trying to teach everybody, not just the player, but everybody, how important the lesson or the tactic was. Then what they would do is after practice, they would tell the position coach, hey, bring said player to my office so we can process that. And then the player would come in and they go, look, here's why I ripped you. It really wasn't about you. It was what you were doing. And I wanted to teach a lesson to everybody else. And I really appreciate this dialogue. And the process after the conflict led to more cohesion and understanding between the player and the coach. I get where you're coming from. You can't really apply that tactic anymore because the coach will rip into the player and then go to his office and say, hey, I want to talk to you in my office after practice. Well, that player then goes into the locker room, he grabs his cell phone, calls maybe his agent, calls the people that are in his inner circle, and they all go, oh man, don't worry about that coach. That coach is nuts, or that coach is whack, or that coach is off. And you're awesome because they're willing to have that transparent, vulnerable conversation of, hey, coach just ripped me one. It's processed with his inner circle, not with the coach. And then goes, yeah, you know what? I don't need to deal with that, coach. And then he'll just leave. And then the coach is waiting in his office, like, hey, where's the player? Where's the player? Where's the player? And they're like, oh, he left the building. Now all of a sudden the coach has a really tough decision. Do I go follow and chase down the player? Do I wait for the player to come to me? Or do I deal with this friction that now exists in our system? So these are the things that we're talking about. And this all kind of falls under that umbrella of compassion. The other element to it, and I appreciate letting me be so verbose, is again, we're having this moment like with Ted Lasso. I have found, and this is kind of where I was originally going with us being a little bit older, is we've watched the pendulum swing between phases where coaches are kind of quote unquote called accountability coaches. They're disciplinarian. They take a military kind of approach to things. Stand here, make your bed in the morning, that kind of like, rigidity. And if you do what I tell you, it's not very compassionate, but it's very authentic and it's very knowledgeable. And then the pendulum swings to what's more like relational. And this is where we're at right now is I think we're kind of coming through that phase, the Ted Lasso phase, where we're really talking about being compassionate leaders and relational leaders. And the idea here is like, oh, we're really going to understand people. We're going to understand what they need and all of this kind of stuff. And then they're going to want to be compelled to do great work. Now, what's interesting is both styles are effective. But if you ask most people which style would you rather be in, it can vary. Most people go, hey, I really like the relationship one because I don't get yelled at and stuff. But when things start to go wrong, they go, no one's really being held to any kind of accountability here. Like people aren't showing up to staff meetings, people aren't showing up on time at practices, or they're not coming prepared. So people who are really invested in winning start to go, gosh, I really kind of like the accountability one because it's holding everybody to the edge of high performance. So it's not that they crave being yelled at, but they crave the discipline that is required for greatness. So, if you sit in the same place long enough, which you and I have, you just watch the pendulum swing. And it's interesting because I think what I've tried to do with leadership is be a resource so that if the style they're using is ineffective, can we help add some skill sets that can help them stay longer?
And listening to what you're saying, I mean, there's one word that comes into my mind in terms of what that centre ground sweet spot might be, because I think, isn't that our skill set as sports psychologists, if we're working with leaders or we're working with coaches, is to help them find that sweet spot between accountability and relational or supportive or whatever word that you want to use there. And I understand that pendulum is going to move back and forward depending on various contextual factors. But to put it in very simple terms, striving to hit that sweet spot. And I think authoritative coaching feels like a useful word there that could fit into that sweet spot. Authoritative being, and maybe this is where one takes the knowledge piece as well, is that it's difficult to be difficult to be a great coach without being an authority on something. But authoritative isn't authoritarian, whereby authoritarian is just simply telling players what to do. Authoritative has that feel of, well, I've got a lot of solutions for you here, but I might engage in autonomy supportive coaching, where I'm going to help you to find the best for you.
I've always thought of authoritarian is like you said, it's almost demanding, right? Like you stand on the wall until I tell you to stop standing.
Yes.
Whereas
But authoritative is,
authoritative for me, and I'd be curious your definition too, but authoritative for me is one that says, I need you to stand on the wall and here's an understanding for why.
yeah,
And so what you do is you get people to kind of buy in to the vision or the task with a little bit of explanation, which requires some more work, right? And it's funny because when you talk about the system, just to go back a click,
mm,
I think something that's relevant here is you don't have to do, as a leader, you don't have to be all of it. That can be a daunting task. What you can do is you can be complementary. So, for example, you can be like the head coach who chooses to be more authoritarian or authoritative. And then you can have an assistant coach who might be more relational or compassionate.
Yes, I agree with that.
So you can team up with people, and you can also be strategic. I think you can also be tactical to your point of when to switch gears. So maybe you're really disciplined with player one, and you're really relational with player two, because that's what player one and player two need. And if you flip those strategies, you just might not get the production that you're hoping for.
Without putting you on the spot to name names, but reflecting back on your 25 years, when you think about that centre ground, if the centre ground is the right place to hold, or the ability to flex between an accountability coach and a supportive coach, relational coach, what great coaching or coaches have you seen in action that are who are hitting that centre ground? What do you see? What does that look like? Do you feel? What are they engaging in?
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? A couple of thoughts here. I think one point of distinction about us as psychologists versus just somebody who might be a life coach or something like that is like, I have found that for me, psychology is about studying and understanding human behavior and human interaction, which again is very complicated. One of the things that I think people do in our role as consultants or consigliaries, as trusted advisors, is people can default to just being a contrarian. And a contrarian is such a like low hanging fruit, easy tactic because clearly something's not working. Otherwise, they don't elicit our help. So all we have to do is just say, it's just not working because. In fact, in pro sports, more often than not, failure is the most common default. So like if you ever want to be right in pro sports, just say it won't work. And whether it's accurate or not, that the cause that you're identifying of why it won't work, but it's easy to say it. Like, oh, it's not going to work because our wide receivers aren't very strong, or oh, it's not going to work because the defensive line coach doesn't know what he's doing. Like, because only one team has success for that one year. Everybody else kind of falls short. And so you can go, see, I told you I was right. So one thing that I'm always mindful about is to not play the easy contrarian role, but to be more of a curious explorer trying to understand what's going on. Now that I've put that out there, I'm about to play a little bit of a contrarian role with you. You talked about, right? There's the extreme authoritative or authoritarian coach. And then you've talked about the extreme relational coach. And then you said, hey, what about the common ground as being the solution? And I would make the argument that that too could be a failure because they're not authoritarian enough
Hmm.
or they're not relational enough. So sometimes it's like compromise can be the thief of greatness too. So going back to your question, I have seen incredibly successful coaches who have worn all three hats, those with a balance and those with an extreme on either end. What's interesting is like the relational coach who was super successful, he had an authoritarian person in the building. So it was like the one head coach that I'm thinking of, their quarterback, who was a Hall of Fame quarterback, was absolutely holding everybody accountable. Similarly, the authoritarian head coach that comes to my mind had an assistant coach who was unbelievably effective at after the head coach tearing up a player. The assistant coach would come over and kind of pick up the pieces, put his arm around him and say, "Hey, you know what coach was really trying to do." And then the person who was balanced is one where you're going like, "Gosh, man, what a what a masterful way of recognizing when to push and when to pull." So there was a coach that I worked with 20 years ago who I recently bumped into, and it's funny the things that we say that we forget that sometimes lands or resonates with them. So he came up to me and he goes, Goldman, Dr. Goldman, Doc, hey, it's good to see you. And I'm like, we hadn't talked in 20 years. He goes, smash them when they think they're going to get hugged and hug them when they think they're going to get smashed, right? And I was like, what? And he goes, yeah, you told me that 20 years ago. And I was like, I think what he was referencing was that a parenting style is to kind of do the unexpected because then the child will more likely listen to the message. So, for example, if you're a parent and your child has messed up, which all children, all human beings do, parents mess up too. But when a child messes up, sometimes they're anticipating the punishment. And if you come in and say, man, that must have been really hard for you, let me put my arm around you, give you a hug, the resonance of the lesson lands more. And same thing, sometimes a child messes up and they think they're going to come to them with a level of nurturance. And you go, hey, this is a pretty important lesson. What happened here isn't acceptable. This is disappointing. Some kind of some kind of sting to it, that too will linger. So the phrase that I used, and I don't mean this literal, was, like hug them when they think they're going to get hit and hit them when they think they're going to get hugged. And that's what he held on to. And it's interesting because at the time he was a position coach. Now he's a head coach. And he found that that has been really useful for him, is to kind of just keep his team and staff a little bit off guard. They just don't know what he's going to do. And that keeps his message to resonate.
You've given us three factors: compassion, knowledge, authenticity. We've spoken to compassion. I think knowledge speaks for itself, although I'm very happy to talk a little bit on that. But it feels like everything you're speaking to here is actually oriented to, or at least a little bit towards the authenticity piece. Know who you are, how you want to deliver, and deliver it in that style. It could be useful as an addendum here. It can be useful to have somebody in the building, if you've got that resource, if you're working at the very highest level of the game, you've got that resource, have somebody in the building who complements your style, who's sort of, by compliment in this scenario, I'm talking perhaps the opposite, perhaps different. Is it the authenticity piece you're speaking to here?
Maybe. So, again, just another interesting element while we're talking about these three buckets.
Mm,
There was some research done that when leaders possessed high levels of compassion and knowledge,
mm,
worker job satisfaction, not productivity, but job satisfaction went up 86%.
mm.
So when a leader displayed both compassion and knowledge, they expressed the right answer to the test, and they were caring and compassionate towards their employees. Job satisfaction went up 86%. Now, the authenticity piece is kind of like, it's just about keeping it real, right? And and so here's what's interesting. It's funny that you go compassion because, and I don't know, this might just be a very American thing. So I had this unbelievable opportunity. This was such a gift
Mm.
where the rugby coaches, the world rugby coaches, the head coaches from all of the countries, they invited me to come and talk about some of this stuff. And I illustrated a study that was shared with me by, I think, Chris Shembrook, or it could have been Mark Aoyagi. Both of them are unbelievable individuals, where they talked about the difference between task cohesion and social cohesion, right?
Mm.
So task cohesion is everybody has mission aligned, we all want to win. Social cohesion is we all want to get along, we all want to be liked. So a good example of where you see that two in conflict is like, let's say you have a teammate who's breaking a rule. For example, he misses curfew. Social cohesion is you cover for that player because we all just want to really gel. Task cohesion is you kind of inform the leadership, this guy's breaking a rule and it's hurting our chances of winning. So I bring this up to the world rugby coaches and they all start talking about, and I asked them, I was like, which do you think is more important? And they all went social cohesion, 100%. And I was like, well, the literature shows that task cohesion impacts winning more. In
Absolutely.
fact, social cohesion only influences winning when it impacts task cohesion. In other words, we will start to align with our mission because we want to be liked. And it became this lively debate with the coaches. It was fascinating. And so I'm still in a state of flux about this, um, which is more valuable kind of thing, because the Ted Lasso story is all about social cohesion. What's interesting is, and where I think I've kind of landed, is if you could do both, why not do
Yeah,
both?
absolutely.
you know, like
Completely agree.
like just because we're all task cohesion aligned, like do your job. New England Patriots had that kind of, which was as much a sword as it was a shield, right? Do your job. Hey, don't worry about what I'm doing. Do your job. That's a task cohesion kind of dialogue. But, you know, many people from that organization, one guy said this to me once and always resonated. He goes, we made ourselves miserable there. I just don't know if we won because of it or despite it. So I don't know. I kind of went on a tangent there. I love how you give me this space to just ramble, and I hope it makes sense to your listeners. In America and the World Rugby coaches, so I've done this kind of dialogue with American coaches. I had an unbelievable opportunity where I was with a bunch of head coaches and GMs in a room for a think tank.
Hmm.
And when I asked them where they were strong, where they were weak, the consensus in the room was compassion. And they all kind of laughed. And I said, that's because you guys are all kind of sociopaths. And then they laughed again. And it was interesting because it's not easy to walk into a room and just accuse a bunch of people of being sociopaths and have them almost enjoy it, right? But I wasn't calling them sociopaths as much as I was saying they engage in sociopathic behavior. And once again, if you look at the literature, and Adam Grant did some great stuff with the whole Givers and Takers
Yeah.
book. I mean, brilliant, brilliant research, and what a brilliant way to deliver the message. But he talked about how, like, the second most successful type of leader is one that's sociopathic,
Hmm.
because they can do the icky and they can do the sticky, right? And if you ever read Edward Sutherland's books, Trying Not to Try, he goes into this too, where he talks about how, like,
Hmm.
sociopaths can act, they're wolves, but they can act like sheep. So what's interesting is, and this is part of where I'm kind of hopefully landing on a point, is during this Ted Lasso movement, what I'm hearing is a lot of wolves that are coming to me asking to be more sheep like. And I can't tell if it's because they want to evolve. And you stimulated me this with the whole, like, how do they have a balance between the relational and the accountability? I can't tell if they're wanting to evolve as a coach or if they're just trying to be a sharper sociopath by being able to pretend. So again, when you look at the two successful groups, the second most successful group is the sociopath, because they can be charismatic and convincing and charming to get people to follow them, and also do the hard stuff like cut a player or fire a friend. And then the most successful, according to Adam Grant, is not the sociopath, but actually the giver, the one that brings people who want to make them the best leader they can be. That they are all that the staff around them, just they want this guy to succeed because they genuinely care about him, because he or she or they generally cares about their people. So I think the authenticity piece is kind of revealing who you are. And what's funny is talking with the American coaches and leaders, they uniformly or commonly will say compassion is their weakness, knowledge is their strength, and authenticity they kind of avoid because they kind of don't want to admit the fact that they're sometimes a wolf in sheep's clothing. I, it's a fascinating conversation with these folks.
You see, I sometimes think the authenticity piece in sport, and I'm going to refer to adult elite sport here, although I think what I'm about to say is the problem that can spill into the adultification of children's sport. Is is authenticity about who you are, or is it about who you feel you need to be? Because I think we're so socialized in sport, especially elite adult sport. But again, speaking to children's sport, the early seriousness element, the adultification element that we see often to the detriment of the experiences of young people in sport. It's not so much who I am, but who I feel I need to be, because I feel it's as a head coach, I feel it's the only way I can get the best out of my plate. I can help them to compete because I have to be this authoritarian. And I just wonder if the battleground at the moment is as much about coaches, head coaches, who are playing with the idea of the notion of I want to I want to do it better. I think there's a way to do it better here. I think that, and I think sports psychology is contributing a lot to this. And as we speak about this a lot on the Sports Psych Show, is that there is a healthier and safer way to help athletes get the most from themselves and compete at their hardest whilst also experiencing a sense of well-being. But that requires that clever, intelligent, subtle hand from a head coach in order to do that. And I don't think either end meets that. I don't think the end of authoritarian coaching, and I don't think the end of supportive coaching or relational coaching meets that. I think it's you can visit those ends absolutely, depending on the context and what's needed, but it's often about center ground that where it's the balance between stretch and support. And I think the socio-historical elements of coaching has always been I have to be authoritarian. And I think coaches are now becoming smarter questioning that. So I wonder, as much as anything, in the conversations in the room, because I love your three buckets, as you call them: authenticity, knowledge, compassion, is coaches actually realizing, I think I can do this in a compassionate way. I can deliver a lot of knowledge in a compassionate way, and I want to explore that. And understanding that this authenticity, I just think it's not so much who they are, but it's who they have felt they needed to be. And I don't know if they need to be the person that they think they needed to be. Authoritarian, by that I mean. My ramble there.
So, Dan, I got to. I find sometimes your podcast can be a little bit challenging for me because I get into what you're saying so much that I forget some of the thoughts that I want to share. And I think that's like maybe that's a good thing, right? Like that's a sign of good active listening. But I like what you have to say, and yet it sometimes stops me short of like, well, wait, what was I going to say again? So um, I think what's really kind of cool about where you're going with this is that notion of understanding what motivates people, you know? And I don't mean motivates by like
Mm,
inspires, but really what motivates towards activation. So like it's funny right now, you'll see this a lot in American sports where they've created these kinds of trophies. It started a few years ago like with the University of Miami created this turnover chain. And what they did, and it became a thing, right? Like every time their defense got a turnover, a person got to wear the chain on the sideline, and it became like a bravado. And then all of a sudden, everybody started creating. So then it became like a wrestling belt, like a championship belt. And then in baseball, like the Los Angeles Angels have like a samurai hat and stuff, like a home run samurai hat. And and so it's interesting because one of the most famous studies was done by a guy named B.F. Skinner, where he was able to train mice to
mm,
press a lever to get a piece of cheese, or he could get a pigeon to peck at something to get birdseed, that kind of stuff. Behaviorism, that study was the benchmark and the origin of behaviorism. What's interesting, and the reason why I tie it to this whole like trophy chain and motivation and stuff is I think collectively are making an error that it's the type of cheese that gets the mouse to press the lever. So if the turnover chain is blingy enough, it's got enough sparkle to it, or if the hat has enough meaning to it, kind of stuff, then people really want it. And that's like saying, well, cheddar versus Swiss versus, a good Irish cheddar or something like that. And what is not written about the B.F. Skinner mouse lever study enough is that it doesn't matter what kind of cheese you put into the experiment. The mouse will never press the lever to get the cheese until the mouse starts to get hungry. So when we talk about understanding players, again, authenticity, knowledge, and compassion, when we talk about understanding your personnel, your staff, it becomes a lot about understanding what their hunger is. Not what kind of cheese they want, but what drives them and what motivates them. So I think passion and purpose has a lot of stuff. I think understanding what gives a person a sense of meaning, a sense of belonging. And so I don't know, that's where my head goes regarding some of what you were just talking about is it's really understanding like what does make a person get out of bed. Like, when I'm talking with quarterbacks in the NFL, for example, I don't know, I got NFL brain, maybe because the season's coming up, but like one question I always ask the NFL quarterbacks is like, why are you willing to get hit? Being a quarterback is like you get just knocked around. I mean, like it hurts, and it's amazing to watch these guys because as they get older, it takes more and more time for them to recover from just the pain of what's going on to their bodies on Sunday. So I like to ask the question like, why are you willing to get hit? Why are you willing to look downfield versus looking out of the corner of your eye for when that guy just crushes you? I mean, some of these hits that the quarterbacks take, they're the equivalent of being in like a 35-mile-per-hour car accident. So understanding what makes a person willing to get hit. And what's amazing is that answer is not universal. It's very, very personal. Some do it because they're trying to like please their dad or anyone who's kind of dad like. Some do it because they want to feel the essence of greatness. Some do it because they want to win at the highest level. Some do it because they love the celebration that is felt in the locker room with their teammates. So if I were to go on a quick tangent, you know, there's four chemicals that are identified when it comes to happiness: dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. Dopamine's really about chasing something, right? Michael Gervais uses this phrase that I love. He talks about like chasing your dopamine. Like, hey, what's causing you to chase your dopamine? You know, like what are you doing to chase your dopamine? So if you think about it, that's like the craving and getting it, like the sensation, like dopamine's released when we feel the notification signal on our phone, and then we have that discomfort until we answer it, and then we feel better. That's dopamine. Oxytocin is really like a lot of people call that one the love one, but really oxytocin is about us coming together. And what's interesting about oxytocin is not only is it about an inclusive element to being, hey, we're a member of a group, it also is identifying people who are outside the group. So as much as it creates that bond, it also has an element of exclusion to it. Serotonin is often known as like the satisfaction one, right? Like, hey, job well done. And dopamine and serotonin kind of go hand in hand. And then endorphins is kind of that feel good that you feel after doing something hard, especially physically exerting, like running a marathon. So I'm always kind of listening to like, you know, which neurochemical are we really kind of pinging on here?
I love everything that you've said there. And Scott, I'm conscious of your time, so we'll wrap up soon. But you've kind of twisted the buckets here in many respects. Maybe you've turned them upside down for me because perhaps the lens of the world we were looking at, or at least I was looking at from an authenticity, knowledge, and compassion piece, was the skills of the coach, the characteristics of the coach, and how the coach wants to go about, or excuse me, the leader wants to go about delivering. Now you've made me think of, you know, your response to what I was saying has made me think about the importance of really professional judgment and decision making around the individual. PJDM, professional judgment and decision making, is a body of literature we've spoken quite a bit about on the Sports Psych Show, and in very simple terms, although I'm sure its authors would not love my simple explanation here, but you can think of professional judgment and decision making as who, what, how, why. Who am I coaching? What do I want to coach them? How am I going to coach them? Why am I going to coach them in this way? Who am I leading? What do I want to lead on? How am I going to lead? Why am I leading in this way? If we're going to talk about leadership, but it starts with the who, and that's what you've made. You've responded to me by saying, well, what is also important here is not so much the coach's lens of the world; it's the coach's lens of who they're coaching. The who is important, right? Um, you know, I suppose I was speaking to this borrowing from Martin Seligman, positive psychology, and can we do this in a better way? Can we have the passion and the purpose and the meaning and the thriving, and let's strive our best. We're not going to love every single second of what we're doing, but let's have a safe and healthy culture, environment, and let's enjoy what we're doing. You made me think with your thoughts on motivation here. There's individual specificity with motivation, and also motivation being a neurochemical phenomenon to a degree. And so, what neurochemicals are we helping people release? And the style in which they release their neurochemicals, how is that influencing them? What I'm trying to say here is there feels like a real individual specific piece to your authenticity, knowledge, and compassion bucket. Who am I coaching? Who is this person, and who are these people in front of me?
Love it. Absolutely love it. And where I'd pull on the thread just a little bit further is it's not just who am I coaching, but also who am I? Who do I want to be? And going back to something you said earlier where you're talking about like kind of like the many faces of Eve, right? Like, you know, you can talk about a coach or a leader as being somebody who wears different hats or is a bit of a chameleon and has to adjust and adapt. And it goes, okay, is that incompatible with being authentic? And I don't know, right? Because as we both know, like who you are as a leader is different than who you might be as a husband or who you might be as a son or a brother or a friend. So I do think, personality is not static or stable. It's very situational. I know that gets us through a whole nother debate between the two of us. But bringing it back to your concept about the who, I think that that question is actually bidirectional. It's not who are they solely, it's who are they and who am I? And once you understand who they are and once you understand who you are, then it becomes a third question, which is who is us? And I think that's where some really cool, meaningful work that we get to do as psychologists and that they get to engage in that I think has some very powerful outputs as far as how it moves the system.
Who is us? I really love that viewpoint, that lens of the relationship, that two-way relationship between player and coach, person and leader, player and leader. How two differing characteristics, two different contexts can influence that relationship. Fascinating, Scott, as always.
You know what? It's amazing how quickly this time feels. What they say, a sign of a good conversation is where you wish you had just 5 more minutes. So, Dan, I can't thank you enough for these conversations. I find I learned so much from you, and I'm grateful for the space you give me to just kind of talk. And these mean a lot to me, maybe more than you know. And I hope it resonates with some of the people who are listening too. So, thank you for doing this.
Well, likewise, Scott. And I know you will have tapped the interest of the Sports Psych Show audience. So, how can people find you and follow you? And how can they learn more about your work and the great work you're doing with the AIQ?
Yeah. So our website is pretty easy to find. It's just aiq.team. And my email is also fairly easy, which is just my first letter of my first name. So S, and then my last name, Goldman, Goldman, at aiq.team. Um, I do have like a LinkedIn account. I do have like I don't know what we call it now because of Elon Musk. Is it Twitter? Is it X? I don't know. But I'll be honest with you, I'm not on the social media space maybe as much as people are telling me I should be. But that's because I think I just enjoy having conversations with people rather than kind of putting stuff out in content. Different people have different strengths. So probably the best way to reach me would be through that aiq.team website or through that email, sgoldman at aiq.team.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for your time, Scott.
Thank you. This was fun.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. I'd be delighted to hear any suggestions you have. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.